Mass protests have erupted in the United States against Donald Trump's policy on the deportation of illegal immigrants. Trump has already sent 2,000 National Guardsmen to Los Angeles fully armed. They are now under the command of the United States Army. Moreover, United States Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has already stated that he is ready to send even Marines to counter ordinary protesting Americans. That means actual regular military personnel, which is absolutely against the Constitution of the United States of America. It is telling that against the backdrop of protests, while Donald Trump is boasting about how we, the Guardsmen, are supposedly dispersing people. Protesters, while Trump is banning the wearing of masks on faces so that it is clear exactly who is protesting. Against all this, local authorities, the governor and city mayors are saying that Trump just put on a show. There was no need to send in the National Guard. On the contrary, this only fuels protest sentiment, saying that the local police were handling the protest just fine. Moreover, local authorities in Los Angeles, California say that in fact the first day of protests on Friday was completely peaceful. There were no clashes and there was no need to send in the National Guard under these circumstances. However, the White House decided to deal with this severely. And they are openly saying that yes, they are sending in the military to show Americans that it's better not to go against Donald Trump's policies. In this episode, we'll go over all the latest news about the protests in the United States of America, analyze the orders of the American president, look at the screw-ups that have already happened, and of course, examine the root cause of these protests and the reaction of the local authorities. Why is there now an open conflict between the White House and local authorities in California against the backdrop of these protests? My name is Alexei Pecci. Next, I'll go over everything in order, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, write any comment you want, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel. The link to it is in the description of this video. So mass protests have begun in the state of California, with clashes involving the police and the National Guard. Because the day before, President Donald Trump signed a presidential order to send 2,000 National Guardsmen to Los Angeles to disperse the protests that began in response to immigration raids. Immigration authorities and demonstrators have been clashing in the Los Angeles area for 2 days. The unrest began on Friday after dozens of people were detained by federal immigration agents in various locations. The arrests are taking place against the backdrop of Donald Trump's immigration crackdown, which has included waves of raids and deportations across the country. I should note here that in that very same big, impressive bill by Donald Trump, $155 billion have already been allocated to catch migrants and deport them from the United States. Law enforcement officers in protective gear have been using tear gas and flashbang grenades to disperse the crowd for 2 days. In downtown Los Angeles and in the city of Paramount. On Saturday, authorities reported multiple arrests, and here is what White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt said, quote, "These operations are necessary to stop and reverse the invasion of illegal criminals into the United States. After this violence, the irresponsible Democratic leaders of California have completely abandoned their responsibility to protect their citizens. California Governor Gavin Newsom called the deployment of troops in the state of California, quote, a deliberate provocation, and warned that it only increases tensions at the protests. As he stated, this is a misguided mission that undermines public trust." Officials from the Trump administration described the protesters as, quote, lawless rioters. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles Police Department stated that Saturday's demonstrations in the city remained peaceful, and the events concluded without incident. It's completely unclear why bringing in the National Guard was necessary. In another part of Los Angeles County, a crowd of protesters in Paramount became increasingly agitated, throwing objects and displaying aggressive behavior toward federal agents and sheriff's deputies. This is a statement from the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department in an advisory message on Saturday evening. In response, the department requested additional resources throughout the county and deployed more sheriff's deputies. In neighboring Compton, a car was set on fire where protesters began to gather. On Friday, video showed several projectiles being thrown at officers equipped with bulletproof vests and protective shields near the Federal Detention Center in Los Angeles. Carolyn Leavitt, the White House press secretary, claims that Trump called in the National Guard to, quote, solve the problem of lawlessness that was allowed to escalate, and that aggressive crowds attacked immigration officers and federal law enforcement agents. Trump exercised his authority under Section 10, which allows the president to call in the National Guard as needed to repel invasions, suppress insurrections, or enforce the laws. However, according to local California authorities, the entire situation is escalating due to Donald Trump's actions. California Governor Gavin Newsom urged protesters in Los Angeles not to resort to violence during protests against immigration, because that would give the Trump administration the spectacle it wants. The California governor is urging protesters not to clash with the National Guard, as it would play into Trump's desired narrative. And then Newsom states the following: the federal government is taking control of the California National Guard and deploying 2,000 soldiers in Los Angeles. Not because there aren't enough law enforcement officers there, but because they want a spectacle. But let's not give them either. Never resort to violence. Express yourself only peacefully, said Governor California. The statement by the governor of California makes sense, because in the White House they're already hinting that in addition to 2,000 National Guardsmen, they're ready to send regular United States Army troops to suppress protests in Los Angeles. United States Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth stated that active-duty United States Marines at Camp Pendleton are on heightened alert for deployment in response to immigrant protests in Los Angeles. In a message on the platform reporting the mobilization of National Guard troops in response to the protests, Hegseth stated that Marines at the base in Southern California could also be called up if the violence continues. As he stated, they are already in a state of heightened readiness. The use of the National Guard to quell protests is usually ordered by governors in coordination with federal authorities, and accordingly, the Trump administration's response to the protests is extremely excessive. And many experts call Hegseth's suggestion about the possible deployment of active troops in Los Angeles the shock of all shocks, as local authorities are now stating. Deploying the National Guard was unnecessary in this situation, let alone threatening with Marines. It's absolutely unthinkable. This violates all the statutes of the United States Constitution when regular troops cannot be used against the American people. So, in his post, Pete Hegseth stated that the immigration raids in Los Angeles were aimed at individuals who posed a huge threat to national security. Quote, under President Trump, violence and destruction against federal agents and federal property will not be tolerated. It's all just common sense. Well, and it also hints that maybe we do need to send in the Marines as well. But the White House doesn't stop, and all of this is starting to look more like a political struggle between Republicans and Democrats. Let me remind you, the governor of California is Democrat I. Trump has already insulted California Governor Gavin Newsom, stating that the administration is forced to take action because the state leader and the mayor of Los Angeles are unable to stop the protests against immigration. Quote from Donald Trump, if California Governor Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass can't do their jobs, and everyone knows they can't, then the federal government will step in and solve the problem of the unrest and what's happening the way it should be solved. It's also interesting that Donald Trump's post was accompanied by photos of the protests and a portrait of Donald Trump under a banner that read Law and Order. As you understand, he's suggesting that only he represents law and order in the country. Human rights organizations are already heavily criticizing Trump's order to the National Guard, stating that the tactics imitate those of authoritarian regimes. I'm hinting that dictator Putin does the same thing in Russia when there are any protests. Instead of allowing people to exercise their absolutely legal constitutional right to protest, an authoritarian regime always brings the National Guard and sometimes even the military out into the streets just to suppress these protests and not let them say anything. At the same time, California Governor Gavin Newsom, after Pete Hegseth's statement, said that the United States Secretary of Defense is demonstrating abnormal behavior by threatening to send active duty Marines to Los Angeles. Next is his quote. The Secretary of Defense is now threatening to send active duty Marines onto American soil against its own citizens. This is abnormal behavior. But the United States Department of Defense doesn't stop there, and the United States Northern Command has announced that it is taking command of the National Guard troops mobilized by order of President Donald Trump. According to the statement from the United States Northern Command, quote, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has instructed the United States Northern Command to take command. 2,000 California National Guard servicemen have been deployed to protect federal personnel and federal property in the greater Los Angeles area in support of the lead federal agency. The statement also says that United States Marines may be involved in the protection operation and that more detailed information will be provided once the units are identified and deployed. So in fact, they have already started the process of preparing and deploying Marines to suppress the protest. Well, I'm not just saying this for no reason. It all looks like political struggle, a political game, if you will, because a certain incident has arisen for Donald Trump. The thing is, Trump praised the National Guard troops early Sunday morning, the ones he federalized in response to the immigrant protests in Los Angeles. Although it later turned out that there were actually no National Guard troops in the city at that time. And they hadn't even entered Los Angeles yet, but Trump was already posting, quote, great job by the National Guard in Los Angeles after 2 days of violence, clashes, and unrest. But after that, the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, wrote, quote, just to be clear, the National Guard has not yet been deployed in the city of Los Angeles. And now journalists, many of whom are on the ground, are saying that there really are no signs that National Guard units are present in Los Angeles. Specifically, in a statement from the United States Northern Command, which will exercise operational control over any federal troops or California National Guard units, it was said several hours before Trump's post that they would provide additional information when the units are identified and deployed. So even the Northern Command said, well, listen, we're just preparing for this to actually deploy the National Guard specifically in Los Angeles. So, the mayor of Los Angeles, Bass, says that he thanks the Los Angeles police and local law enforcement for their work this evening. That was his quote. To clarify, the local police are operating in Los Angeles. The National Guard has not been deployed there yet. Well, at least at the moment when Trump was already saying, yeah, good job. The National Guard is restoring order. You see, I gave the order. Everyone sent the National Guard. It's already restoring order. It just wasn't there yet. At the same time, Trump is beginning to employ tactics reminiscent of authoritarian regimes, which I mentioned earlier. The thing is, Trump announced this morning that he would ban protesters from wearing masks after 2 days of unrest in Los Angeles. Quote, masks cannot be worn at protests. What do these people have to hide and why? However, interestingly, immigration officers are allowed to wear masks. And the acting director of the agency, Todd Lyon, recently stated that agents wear masks to protect their identities so that people can't see who they are. But, you know, I remember the times of Maidan in Ukraine when Yanukovych also banned wearing masks. So that law enforcement agencies could easily identify exactly who was in front of them. That is, so that they could later find this person. Well, we all know very well how Yanukovych's path ended. But of course, I have to shed light on the other side of the coin, the other position. FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino stated that the Bureau is investigating alleged cases of demonstrators obstructing immigration control operations. At the same time, United States Vice President J.D. Vance wrote the following. Insurgents with foreign flags are attacking immigration officers. Meanwhile, half of America's political leadership has decided that border security is evil. This is, of course, a hint at the Democrats. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass stated that many people in Los Angeles County are frightened by the recent actions of federal immigration control. She added that the reports of unrest deeply concern her. Further quoting her, "We are in direct contact with officials in Washington District of Columbia and are working closely with law enforcement agencies to find the best way forward. Everyone has the right to peaceful protest, but let me be clear, violence and destruction are unacceptable and those responsible will be held accountable." The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department stated that it is taking measures to ensure public safety by managing traffic and monitoring crowd gatherings. In addition, the statement from the Immigration Service says, quote, "Our brave officers were vastly outnumbered when more than 1,000 rioters surrounded and attacked the federal building." And it also states that it took 2 hours to somehow respond and resolve this issue. However, the Los Angeles police stated that they mobilized personnel and acted as quickly as safety conditions allowed. At the same time, Los Angeles Mayor Bass described the arrests of immigrants as mass chaos. She stated that she was not informed about the raids in advance, and as she says, this creates a sense of horror throughout the entire community. The Immigration Service literally chased people down the street. It is reported that at least 44 people were arrested by federal immigration agents. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers conducted searches in 3 locations, and accordingly, this started to cause a certain amount of panic. The actions of federal law enforcement began on the same day when numerous sources reported that the Trump administration was preparing for a large-scale withdrawal of federal funding from California. Well, that's why I said that to some extent, this is a political move on the part of the White House. So in general, we can conclude that indeed the United States Immigration Service began to detain migrants en masse in the state of California, particularly in Los Angeles, and no one was warned about it. And now the local authorities say that this actually caused chaos because these were mass detentions. There was even an incident when one of the presidents of a labor union in California was also detained. Despite being American, his documents were all in order. But he was also detained for allegedly obstructing federal agents' access to workplaces where migrants were supposedly present. After that, it turned out that he was injured during the detention. And then they just let him go and said, well, sorry, it was just a mistake. The local authorities, because they, the Democrats, were not warned by the White House at all that such raids were being prepared. This, of course, caused immense chaos. And now it looks like the White House is just trying to show the California authorities who's in charge here, because these are clearly political disputes. There was no need to send in the National Guard, no need to call up the army. The police were basically handling things on the ground without Washington's help. Nevertheless, on top of that, the White House also wants to cut federal funding for California. It all looks like purely political struggle. And chaos had to be created in the streets to show that supposedly the local authorities are absolutely unable to handle the situation. That's why the White House is forced to take the whole situation into its own hands. I'll put an ellipsis here for now. Write your opinion and your conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like.